A man enters a room full of familiar faces. He smiles, not the calculated smile of someone who measures every gesture, but a whole disarming smile, as if he still believes that people say what they really feel. Someone makes a joke at his expense. He laughs along, not because he's smart enough to pretend he doesn't care, but because he genuinely didn't notice the venom wrapped up in the joke. The others exchange glances. There is something disturbing about that innocence. Not the innocence of someone who doesn't know, but of someone who refuses to learn the game. Minutes later, he leaves the room without realizing he has just been dissected, categorized, discarded. He didn't hear the silence that came after the laughter. He didn't see the contempt disguised as pity. And maybe he never will, because for him the world still works differently, a way that no longer exists, or that never existed. There is something deeply disturbing about watching someone be devoured simply because they don't know how to play dirty. We are not talking about naivety in the childish sense, that fragile innocence that has not yet been tested by the world. We are talking about something much more disturbing, the tragedy of those who know cruelty, who see hypocrisy, but who nevertheless refuse to adopt the masks that would ensure their survival. This is the man Dostoevsky called an idiot, not because he lacked intelligence, but because he had something in abundance that the rest of us have learned to stifle, the unshakable belief that sincerity can still have a place in a world of players. Prince Mishkin is not just any character, he is a brutal experiment. Dostoevsky threw him into the midst of 19th century Russian society, an arena of refined hypocrisy, where every gesture hid an intention, every word carried a second meaning, and every relationship was an emotional chess game, and observed with the surgical coldness of someone who already knew the outcome, how that pure man would slowly be torn apart, not by obvious villains, not by overwhelming external forces, but by the simple social mechanics of a world that has learned to punish those who dare to be transparent. And the most terrifying thing is not what happens to Mishkin. It is realizing that if you were in that room, you would probably be on the side of those who laughed. Because we have all learned at some point that there is too high a price to pay for authenticity. That vulnerability is not a virtue, but a weakness to be exploited. That those who do not master the art of dissimulation will always be the first to be sacrificed. And so we become accomplices, not because we are monsters, but because the alternative, remaining defenseless, seems like a death sentence. Dostoevsky knew this. He did not write The Idiot to console us with the fantasy that goodness always triumphs. He wrote to show us without mercy what happens when a good man is thrown among wolves who have learned to dress as lambs. And the question he leaves us with, the same one that still burns like a poorly extinguished ember, is not whether Mishkin could have survived. It is whether we, in his place, would have the courage to do differently, or whether we crossed the line so long ago that we became those who crush the pure and call it realism. Because the hardest truth to swallow is this: perhaps the fool is not the one who refuses to play the game. Perhaps the fool is the one who plays so well that he forgot there was another way to live. Mishkin's kindness is not ignorance. That is the first mistake we make when trying to understand him. He is not good because he does not know how the world works. He is good despite knowing. And that changes everything. Because it is one thing to be naive due to lack of experience. Time corrects that, the world teaches, pain educates. It is quite another, much more disturbing thing to look directly at the rot and choose not to bow to it. Mishkin sees evil. He recognizes it. He even names it. But he refuses to replicate it. And it is this refusal that transforms him in the eyes of others. Not into a saint, but into a manufacturing defect. Jean-Paul Sartre would say that Mishkin is a man of bad faith in reverse. In existentialist philosophy, bad faith is when someone hides behind social roles, ready-made excuses, collective justifications for not taking responsibility for their own freedom. It is when you say, I am like this because the world is like this, and use that as a moral safe conduct to do what you know is wrong. The whole of society lives in bad faith. Everyone protects themselves behind the same comfortable lie. If everyone plays dirty, I can too. It wasn't my choice. It was adaptation. But Mishkin does not accept this excuse. He looks at the game and says, without words, just with his way of being, I can choose differently. And that is intolerable. Because if one man can choose not to be cynical, then everyone else has lost the right to say they had no choice. If Mishkin manages to remain honest, then the excuse that sustains collective hypocrisy collapses. And no one wants to see their excuses collapse. It is easier to destroy the man who exposes the lie than to admit that you always knew you were lying to yourself. There is a scene in the novel, not a dramatic scene, but one of those almost imperceptible moments that Dostoevsky scatters like shards of glass throughout the text, in which Mishkin hears someone tell a story of betrayal. The person telling the story is laughing. They are turning their own cowardice into an anecdote. and Mishkin just looks. He does not judge. He does not accuse, but his gaze carries something destabilizing. He sees the pain behind the laughter. He sees the shame disguised as cynicism, and that, for the person telling the story, is worse than any explicit condemnation, because being judged still leaves you in the position of a victim of someone else's morality. But being seen, really seen, with all the layers stripped away, that leaves you naked before yourself. And there is nothing more unbearable than that. Nietzsche, who was an obsessive reader of Dostoevsky, wrote that no one lies as much as the indignant. He was right. Indignation is almost always armor against guilt. You don't cry out against injustice because it offends you morally. You cry out because deep down you know you are complicit in it, and you need the noise to drown out the inner voice that accuses you. Mishkin does not shout. He is not indignant. He just sees. And that makes everyone around him suddenly become too loud. They need to fill the silence he leaves. They need to laugh louder, speak faster, justify themselves more vehemently. Because in the presence of someone who does not play the game becomes visible. And what is visible can no longer be ignored. But here is the cruel paradox. The more Mishkin remains true to himself, the more unbearable he becomes. Not because he is aggressive, not because he imposes his morality on others, but because his mere existence is a silent accusation. He doesn't need to point the finger at anyone. His very being already does that. And what do we do with accusations we cannot refute? With mirrors that show us what we would rather not see? We break them. We ridicule them. We despise them. We turn the mirror into a villain so we don't have to face the reflection. There is a quote by Oscar Wilde that captures this with surgical precision. To be natural is the most difficult of all poses. Mishkin does not pose. He doesn't construct a calculated persona to fit others' expectations. He simply is. And that, in a world where everyone is constantly performing acceptable versions of themselves, is almost an offense. Because if he can be authentic, then what's stopping you? The answer, of course, is fear. Fear of being ridiculed. Fear of being exploited. Fear of being crushed. And these fears are not irrational. They are, in fact, perfectly justified. Because the world really crushes the authentic. The world really punishes those who let their guard down. But here's the question Dostoevsky forces us to face. If everyone is afraid to be authentic because the world punishes authenticity, then who is creating this world? Who are the agents of this punishment? The answer is as obvious as it is painful. We are. Every cynical laugh, every exploitation of someone else's good faith, every time you saw someone being too sincere and thought, that one won't last long, you were helping to build the world that crushes the Mishkins. You were, without realizing it, one of the wolves. And maybe that's why the book disturbs us so much. Not because it tells a sad story about a good man, but because it forces us to ask, how many times have I been the wolf? How many times have I laughed at someone else's naivety and called it intelligence? How many times have I exploited someone's trust and justified it with "that's life"? Dostoevsky does not let us escape this reading unscathed. He drags us into the text and forces us to recognize that Mishkin is not just a distant victim. He is a reflection of all those we have helped to destroy. And the most terrifying part, we will continue to do so. Because the alternative, stepping down from the safety of cynicism and risking being crushed ourselves, seems too impossible. It seems like emotional suicide. And so we choose complicity. We choose to laugh along. We choose to play the game. And we call it maturity. But is it? Or have we just learned to give pretty names to our own cowardice? There is a type of person that society never knows exactly how to deal with. They are not the villains. Those are easy to categorize, to fight, to turn into declared enemies. They are not the neutral ones. Those are comfortable because they do not require a position. They are those who insist on being good in a world that has already decided that goodness is a strategic weakness. Paradoxically, these people generate more discomfort than those who are openly bad, because evil confirms our suspicions about human nature. But genuine goodness? That challenges all the logic of survival we have built. It forces us to ask, if he can do it, why can't I? And that question is unbearable. Dostoevsky understood this better than any sociologist. He saw firsthand how kindness is treated as an anomaly. During his years in Siberia, sentenced to hard labor for political crimes that were in essence just ideas too dangerous for the regime, he lived alongside murderers, thieves, and rapists. And he discovered something that shook his certainties. Those men were not monsters. They were human, all too human, as Nietzsche would say, capable of brutal generosity, fierce loyalty, selective compassion, but also of disconcerting cruelty, casual betrayal, remorseless violence. And what shocked him most was not the presence of evil, but the absence of any coherent moral system. They were neither good nor evil. They were adaptive. They did what worked. And what didn't work, like selfless kindness, was seen as a personality flaw. It was there, in that frozen hell, that Mishkin was born. Not as a romantic idealization, but as an existential question. What would happen if we threw a truly good man into the midst of this world of adaptives? Not a naive man who hadn't yet learned the rules, but a man who had learned them and decided to reject them. Dostoevsky already knew that the answer would be tragic, but he needed to write it anyway, because some truths can only be told through fiction. Throughout the novel, Mishkin encounters people who constantly oscillate between two reactions: admiration and contempt. Neither of these reactions, however, is genuine. The admiration is laden with implicit condescension. How touching that he still believes in such things. As if they were facing a child who has not yet discovered that Santa Claus does not exist. Contempt, on the other hand, comes disguised as realism. He won't survive long like that. As if the inevitable destruction of the other were a comforting confirmation that you made the right choice in becoming cynical. But there is something that neither of these reactions can hide: discomfort. Because Mishkin does not ask permission to be good. He doesn't try to convert anyone. He doesn't make moralizing speeches. He simply acts from a different logic. And this unwittingly exposes the charade that everyone else is performing. Alexis de Tocqueville, the French political thinker, wrote that nothing is more difficult to forgive than a moral superiority that humiliates us. Not that Mishkin tries to be superior, but his existence, by contrast, makes everyone around him feel inferior, and no one forgives that. Think about how many times you felt uncomfortable, not offended, just uncomfortable, by someone's genuine kindness. That person who helps without expecting anything in return, who forgives without demanding repentance, who trusts even after being betrayed. Do you admire them? Perhaps. But you also feel something else that's harder to name. A mixture of distrust and envy. Distrust because no one is like that without ulterior motives. Envy because if that person can live like that, then you no longer have the excuse that it's impossible. And so, to ease the discomfort, you do one of two things. Either you turn that person into a saint, which puts them on such a high pedestal that they cease to be a viable example for mere mortals like you. Or you turn them into an idiot, which justifies your own cynicism as realism. Dostoevsky does not let us choose either of these easy ways out. Mishkin is not a saint. He suffers. He doubts. He makes mistakes. He is painfully human. But he's also not an idiot in the pejorative sense. He sees the traps. He perceives the manipulations. He simply chooses not to respond in kind. And that makes him something that society does not know how to process. A free man. Free from the obligation to retaliate. Free from the need to protect himself. Free from the compulsion to win. Sartre would say that Mishkin is the only character in the novel who is not acting in bad faith. All the others, Rogozhin, Nastasia Filipovna, Ganya, even General Epanchin, are trapped in roles they themselves created, but which now imprison them. Rogozhin is condemned to be the man of violent passions. Nastasia is trapped in her own performative self-destruction. Ganya cannot escape the mediocrity he so despises in himself. They do not choose who they are. They react to what the world expects of them. Mishkin, on the other hand, acts from something internal. Something that does not depend on external validation. And this makes him, paradoxically, the strongest of them all. But it is a strength that society interprets as weakness. Because the strength we know is that which dominates, imposes, and conquers. Mishkin's strength is different. The strength to remain. To not bow down, to not be corrupted. And this strength, the strength of integrity, is invisible to those who only see the world as a battlefield. To them, Mishkin is just someone who has not yet understood that he is at war. Someone who has not yet learned that kindness is a bargaining chip, not an intrinsic value. Someone who, sooner or later, will be crushed by his own naivety. And they are not wrong. Mishkin will be crushed. Dostoevsky does not lie about that. But the question he poses to us is not whether Mishkin will survive. It is whether survival at any cost is still worthwhile. Whether what remains of you after all the concessions, after all the masks, after all the corruption necessary to stay on your feet is still you. Or if it is just a performative ghost of who you could have been. And maybe that's why we hate Mishkin. Not because he is weak, but because he forces us to face the price we pay to be strong. The price we pay to survive. The price we pay to win. And when we weigh everything, everything we sacrificed, everything we betrayed, everything we let die inside us, the question we don't want to ask, but that Dostoevsky shoves down our throats is this: was it worth it? You know the answer. I know the answer. Everyone knows. But to admit it would be to admit that Mishkin is not the idiot. And if he isn't, then who is? Dostoevsky didn't write the idiot sitting comfortably at his desk, contemplating philosophical abstractions about human nature. He wrote with his hands still trembling from the chains he wore in Siberia, with his eyes still burning from the snow that blinded the convicts as they broke rocks in temperatures that killed weaker men. He wrote from a place most writers never had to visit, real hell. Not the metaphorical hell of bourgeois loneliness or existential boredom, but the concrete hell of sleeping next to murderers, eating from the same plate as rapists, discovering that the line between you and monsters is much thinner than you would like to admit. It was there in that labor camp that Dostoevsky lost his illusions about humanity, but it was also there that he found something that haunted him for the rest of his life. The possibility of redemption was not where he imagined it to be. It was not in moral discourses, religious institutions, or political theories. It was in the most unlikely gestures. A criminal who shared his bread, a guard who looked away at the right moment, a kind word exchange between men whom society had already discarded as human trash. And he realized with painful clarity that kindness was not a matter of education or social class. It was a choice, an absurd, irrational, almost suicidal choice, but a choice nonetheless. And so he created Mishkin, not as an unattainable ideal, but as a brutal experiment. What happens when you throw that choice, the choice to remain good, into the midst of a society that functions in the opposite way? 19th century Russia was a boiling cauldron. The dying aristocracy tried to maintain a veneer of sophistication while rotting from within. Newly freed serfs wandered aimlessly, free in name but trapped in misery. Intellectuals fervently debated the future while the present crumbled. And in the midst of it all, the orthodox faith that had once given meaning to Russian identity began to crack under the weight of questions that no one could answer anymore. It was the kind of time when people desperately need to believe in something but no longer know what. And in that vacuum of meaning, anything can fill the void. Nihilism, cynicism, violence justified by revolutionary ideals. Dostoevsky saw all this swirling around him and understood that he was witnessing not only the collapse of a social order, but the collapse of the very idea that human existence had an inherent purpose. And it was precisely at this moment of total disintegration that he decided to insert a man who still believed in purity, not because he thought it would save anything, but because he needed to see, with the precision of a scientist, how purity would be destroyed. Because if there is one thing Dostoevsky learned in Siberia, it is that you don't really understand human nature by looking at its moments of glory. You understand it by looking at its moments of collapse. And Mishkin was collapse in slow motion. The autopsy of a good man. The most disturbing thing is that Dostoevsky knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't writing to entertain. He was dissecting. Every character Mishkin encounters is a different facet of human corruption. Rogozhin is unbridled passion, desire that devours everything, including himself. Nastasia Filipovna is self-destruction as performance, the woman who was so wounded that she turned her own ruin into a work of art. Ganya is self-aware mediocrity, the man who knows he will never be great but cannot stop envying those who are. And all of them, absolutely all of them, orbit around Mishkin like moths around a flame. Not because he deliberately attracts them, but because he represents something they have already lost and would secretly like to recover. The possibility of being whole. But here is the cruelty of the experiment. None of them can allow themselves to recover it. Because recovering integrity would mean admitting that they lost it. It would mean looking squarely at everything they have done, at all the concessions, at all the small and large betrayals that have made them what they are now. And that is unbearable. It is easier to destroy Mishkin than to admit that he is right. There is a perverse logic to this dynamic. When you build your entire identity on the idea that the world is just like that, there's no way around it, any evidence to the contrary is not just an intellectual challenge. It is an existential threat, because if the world is not like that, if it is possible to live differently, then you have wasted your life. You have betrayed yourself for nothing. And no one wants to face that kind of truth. So you attack, not because Mishkin did anything against you, but because he exists, and his existence is an accusation. Dostoevsky, who had survived hell and returned with his eyes wide open, saw this mechanism everywhere. He saw it at aristocratic parties, where everyone smiled with sharp teeth. He saw it in the discussions of intellectuals, where every word was a weapon disguised as an idea. He even saw it in himself when he felt anger toward those who still had faith, as if their faith were a personal offense to his own doubt. And he put all of this into the novel. Every comma was a razor. Every paragraph was a broken mirror that reflected not only the characters, but also the reader. Because in the end, The Idiot is not a book about 19th century Russia. It is a book about you, about me, about any society that has learned to treat kindness as a symptom of weakness and cynicism as evidence of intelligence. Dostoevsky was not interested in writing beautiful literature. He was interested in making you bleed. in forcing you to ask, if Mishkin appeared in your life today, what would you do? Would you protect him? Or would you be just another one in the line of those who help push him into the abyss? And the answer, if you are honest, is probably not what you would like to admit. What is most frightening about the idiot is not that Mishkin is destroyed. In a way, we already expected that. What is frightening is how he is destroyed. There is no great villain. There is no elaborate conspiracy. There is no dramatic moment when someone stabs him in the back while sinister music plays in the background. Mishkin's destruction happens in an almost bureaucratic way. Small daily cruelties, laughter that lasts a second too long, looks that say poor idiot, without needing to verbalize it. He is not murdered. He is worn down, like a stone that the river erodes until there is nothing left but sand. And perhaps that is exactly what Dostoevsky wanted to show us. Evil does not need to be spectacular to be devastating. In fact, the most efficient evil is banal evil, the kind that hides behind "it was just a joke, I didn't mean it, you're too sensitive." Evil that does not show its true face because it has learned that it is easier to destroy when you keep your hands clean. Charles Baudelaire, the French poet who understood abysses, once wrote that, "The world only forgives those who make it comfortable in its own rottenness." Mishkin does not offer this comfort. He does not validate the lies that everyone tells themselves. He does not laugh at cruel jokes. He does not pretend not to see when someone is hurting another person. And for that, he must be eliminated. Not violently, that would be too dramatic. It could even generate guilt. But systematically, through gradual isolation, through constant ridicule, through exclusion that always seems accidental but never is. The characters around Mishkin are fascinating precisely because none of them are purely evil. Rogozhin, for example, is not a monster. He is a man consumed by a passion he does not know how to process. There are moments when he looks at Mishkin with something bordering on brotherly love. But this love is always mixed with envy, contempt, and a deep anger at seeing in Mishkin everything he would like to be but will never achieve. And so he oscillates. He protects and hurts. He admires and destroys, as we all do with those who show us our own limitations. Nastasia Filipovna is even more complex. She was broken by the world long before she met Mishkin, abused, objectified, reduced to a commodity from a young age. And then she did what many do when they realize that the world will not stop hurting them. She decided to control her own destruction. If she was going to be destroyed anyway, at least it would be by her own choice. Mishkin enters her life offering something she no longer knows how to accept, the possibility of being loved unconditionally. And that terrifies her, because accepting this love would mean believing that she deserves to be saved. And she decided long ago that she doesn't deserve it. So she does what all wounded people do when someone genuinely good comes along. She tests him. She pushes him away. She hurts him. Not because she wants to drive Mikhail away, but because she needs to confirm that he will leave. Because if he stays, she will have to face the possibility that her self-destruction was not inevitable. It was a choice. And admitting that you could have chosen differently is more painful than continuing the downward spiral. And Mishkin, he doesn't give up, but he also doesn't know how to help her, because the tragedy of absolute kindness is that it is not enough. You can offer everything you have, you can be willing to sacrifice yourself completely, but if the other person has already decided they don't want to be saved, there is nothing you can do, except watch and break down together. There is something deeply revealing in the way Dostoevsky constructs this dynamic. He doesn't let us hate them. He doesn't let us say, look, these are the villains, these are the guilty ones. Because the truth is more disturbing than that. The truth is that all the characters are at the same time victims and executioners. They have all been hurt. They are all hurting others. And Mishkin is at the center of this circle of pain like a wheel that doesn't turn. He doesn't fight back. He doesn't protect himself. He just absorbs and absorbs until there is nothing left of him to absorb anymore. If you are listening to this and feeling a growing discomfort in your chest, it's because you already understand where this is going. Because you have been Mishkin at some point in your life. That time you trusted and were betrayed. That time you helped and were used. That time you loved unreservedly and were discarded when it was no longer convenient. And perhaps, if you are brutally honest, you have also been Rogozhin or Nastasia. You have pushed someone away because their kindness exposed something in you that you preferred to keep hidden. And if this video is making you think, not in an abstract way, but in a visceral way, recognizing patterns in your own life, then it's worth going deeper. Because Dostoevsky didn't write to be decorative. He wrote to wake people up. And if you want to stay awake, subscribe to the channel. Not because I need numbers, but because you deserve to continue this journey with your eyes open, to understand not only the world, but your own complicity in it. But let's get back to Mishkin, because the cruelest part is yet to come. He is not only rejected, he is turned into an object. People stop seeing him as a person and start seeing him as a symbol, as a project of salvation, as a mirror of their own neuroses. Nastasia sees him as the impossible redeemer. Rogozhin sees him as the obstacle he must eliminate. Aglaya sees him as the romantic fantasy she can use to annoy her parents. No one, absolutely no one, sees him as simply Mishkin, a man, with fears, doubts, weaknesses, and that's what we do with the good ones. We can't let them be human. We need to either sanctify them, put them on such a high pedestal that they cease to be a viable example, or demonize them, find the flaw that justifies our contempt. Because if they are just human like us but choose differently, then we no longer have an excuse. Mishkin's destruction is not an event, it is a process, and everyone around him contributes a small part. No one wants to take responsibility for the final collapse, but everyone participated, like in a collective execution where each person strikes such a small blow that they can say, "I barely touched him." But in the end, he is dead, or worse than dead, he is empty. A body that still breathes but whose soul has been eroded until it disappeared. And you know what's most terrifying? This continues to happen, every day, in every school where the too weird kid is isolated until he breaks, in every workplace where the too honest person is seen as a threat, in every family where the one who dares to be vulnerable is treated as weak. We are the society that crushes the Mishkins, and then we pretend to be surprised when they disappear. There is a moment in the novel so subtle that many readers pass it by without noticing, when someone asks Mishkin why he doesn't defend himself, why he doesn't fight back when he's attacked, why he doesn't play the game that everyone else plays. And his answer is devastating in its simplicity. But I don't know how. It's not that he's playing the martyr. It's not that he wants to suffer. He genuinely doesn't know. The language of cruelty, manipulation, power games, all of this is foreign to him. It's like trying to explain colors to someone who was born blind. He sees people doing it. He sees the results. But he can't process the internal logic that would justify that behavior. And we, reading this, have two options. We can laugh at his naivety, or we can ask ourselves, when did we learn this language? When did cruelty cease to be something shocking and become something natural? No one is born knowing how to play dirty. It is taught. But who taught it? And why did we accept the lesson without question? Emil Cioran, the Romanian philosopher who spent his life distilling pessimism into cutting phrases, wrote about the torment of existing, that rare and devastating condition of feeling the pain of others as if it were your own. Mishkin has this. He doesn't just see the suffering of others, he feels it, as if there were no clear boundary between where he ends and the other begins. It is a form of empathy that goes beyond intellectual understanding. It is visceral, physical, and exhausting. Most of us have learned to turn it off, not because we are monsters, but because it is impossible to live carrying the pain of the whole world. So we build walls. It's not my problem. Everyone has their own problems. I already have enough to deal with. And these walls are necessary for psychological survival. No one disputes that. But here's the question that Dostoevsky forces us to face. At some point, without realizing it, these walls ceased to be just protection. They became a prison. And now we are so entrenched behind them that anyone who dares to live without walls seems insane. Is Mishkin insane? From the point of view of survival logic, perhaps yes. He does not protect himself. He does not calculate risks. He does not measure his words. He just exists with a complete vulnerability that challenges the entire social architecture we have built to avoid being hurt. And for that, he must be eliminated. Not because he is a real threat, but because he is a walking question. A question that no one wants to answer. Why did you stop being like that? You were once Mishkin, perhaps as a child before you learned that trusting is dangerous. Perhaps in a relationship, before you discovered that vulnerability can be used against you. Perhaps with a friend, before you realized that he was telling your secrets to others for entertainment. And then you made a decision that at the time seemed inevitable, pragmatic, mature. You learned to protect yourself, to play the game, to wear a mask, and you called it growing up. But here's the truth that no one wants to admit. You didn't grow up. You shrank. You traded the possibility of being hurt for the certainty of never being whole again. And now, when you see someone who hasn't made that trade, someone who still dares to be authentic, you feel something that's hard to name. It's not exactly envy. It's not exactly contempt. It's a mixture of the two, seasoned with anger. Anger that that person is exposing the lie you tell yourself every day, that there was no other option. Because there was. There always was. You just chose not to see it. And before you defend yourself, but the world is cruel. I had to adapt, there was no other way. Stop, breathe, and be honest for a second. How many times have you used the world is cruel as an excuse to be cruel too? How many times have you hurt someone and justified it with, it's better to learn early how things work? How many times have you seen someone being crushed and done nothing because it wasn't your problem? Nietzsche was right when he said that those who were seen dancing were judged insane by those who could not hear the music. Mishkin dances. He hears music that the rest of us have already unlearned, and our response is not to try to hear it too. It is to declare that the music does not exist, that he is crazy, that he needs to be medicated, institutionalized, silenced. Because if we admit that the music exists, we will have to admit that we have chosen deafness. And that, my dear, is unbearable. It is easier to destroy the dancer than to admit that you have forgotten the steps. The real tragedy of the idiot is not in the pages of the book. It is in the fact that decades after Dostoevsky died, we continue to do exactly the same thing. We continue to crush the Mishkins. We continue to laugh at naivety. We continue to call cynicism wisdom and vulnerability weakness. And then, in those rare moments when we are alone with our thoughts, late at night when the masks finally come off, we wonder why we feel so empty. The answer is obvious, but to look at it head-on would require courage. And courage, ironically, is the one thing we lack. Because we have learned to survive, but we have forgotten how to live. We have learned to win, but we have forgotten what it means to be true. We have learned to play the game, but we have forgotten that the game is nothing more than a pathetic theater where everyone pretends that it matters who is winning. Mishkin doesn't play, and so in the eyes of the world he loses. But does he really lose? Or is it us, the winners, who pay too high a price to be able to say we haven't lost? A price that included sacrificing everything that made us human in the name of a victory that in the end means nothing. Dostoevsky doesn't answer. He just puts the mirror in front of us and waits. And the question that echoes is not about Mishkin. It's about you. It's about me. It's about all of us who have learned to call our own cowardice realism and our own coldness maturity. The idiot is not the one who remains upright in a corrupt world. The idiot is the one who corrupted himself and called it evolution. Mishkin's final destruction does not happen with fanfare. There is no dramatic music. There is no cathartic monologue where he finally confronts his destroyers. There is no poetic justice where the guilty realize too late what they have done. There is only silence. And then, emptiness. He does not die heroically. He does not become an inspiring martyr. He simply fades away, like smoke, like something that was there and suddenly is no longer there. Dostoevsky denies us catharsis. He could have written an ending where Mishkin dies saving someone, where his sacrifice finally opens the eyes of others, where there is at least some redemptive meaning in all that suffering. But he doesn't do that, because life doesn't work that way. And Dostoevsky, after all he had been through, was not interested in comforting lies. He was interested in the truth. And the truth is that good people are destroyed every day, and the world keeps turning as if nothing had happened. Mishkin's collapse is presented almost as a footnote. He goes mad. He returns to the state of clinical idiocy that he had overcome before the beginning of the novel. He is hospitalized, and then the book ends. The other characters go on with their lives, some with vague remorse, others without even thinking much about what happened. Because in the end, Mishkin was just a temporary detour in everyone's trajectory, a disturbance that has been eliminated, and now everything can go back to normal. T.S. Eliot captured this cruel logic in a verse that seems to have been written for Mishkin. This is how the world ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. There is no apocalypse. There is no final revelation. There is only the silent disappearance of something beautiful that the world did not know how to protect, and perhaps did not want to protect, because protecting Mishkin would mean admitting that he was right, and if he was right, then everyone else was wrong. And that is a truth too big to swallow. Mishkin's madness is not a sudden breakdown. It is the inevitable consequence of trying to contain oceans of other people's pain in a human body. He absorbed it, and absorbed it, and absorbed it. Nastasia's suffering, Rogojin's violence, Ganya's bitter mediocrity, Aglaya's cruel frivolity. He tried to carry it all alone, believing that if he endured enough, he might be able to prevent those people from destroying themselves. But you can't save those who don't want to be saved. And you can't carry everyone's cross without being crushed by the weight. His madness is not weakness. It is the last act of resistance of a mind that refuses to adapt. Because adapting would mean accepting that the world is right. It would mean learning to be cruel. And Mishkin, until the last moment of lucidity, refuses. So his mind does the only thing it can. It shuts down. Because remaining conscious in that world for someone like him would be perpetual torture. And we, reading this, want to protest. We want there to be meaning, a lesson. But at least But Dostoevsky doesn't give us that. He forces us to sit with the discomfort, with pure, unredeemed injustice. Because that's exactly what you do when you meet a Mishkin in real life. You sit with the discomfort for a moment. Maybe you feel a twinge of guilt, and then you move on, because it's easier, because you have your own things to deal with, because in the end it wasn't really your responsibility. But here's what Dostoevsky doesn't say explicitly, but which permeates every line of the book. The responsibility belongs to everyone. Every time you laughed at someone's naivety, every time you exploited someone else's good faith and felt smart for it, every time you saw someone being crushed and looked away, you were creating the world that destroys the Mishkins, not in a spectacular way, but in a systemic, molecular, imperceptible way, like erosion. Each drop seems harmless, but in the end, the rock dissolves. And perhaps the reason why the idiot still disturbs us more than a century later is because nothing has changed. Technology has changed, politics has changed, but the fundamental mechanics of how we treat the good, that has remained exactly the same. We still laugh at the vulnerable. We still call cynicism maturity. We still crush those who dare to be authentic and then wonder why the world seems increasingly empty. Mishkin does not leave us an inspiring legacy. He leaves us with a burning question. A question that cannot be answered with words but only with actions. A question that each of us will have to answer every time we meet someone who has not yet learned to play dirty. What are you going to do? Because Mishkin's fall is not just his fall. It is the fall of all of us who choose to watch. Then the book closes, and you are left there, holding the emptiness. Because Dostoevsky did not give you a resolution. He did not give you comfort. He did not tell you that in the end everything would be fine. He just showed you with the precision of a scalpel how we destroy what we should protect. And now you have to decide what to do with that. There are readers who close The Idiot and decide that Dostoevsky was wrong. That the world isn't that cruel. That Mishkin was a literary exaggeration, a philosophical experiment that doesn't apply to reality. And maybe it's easier to believe that. Because the alternative, recognizing that you've been an accomplice to this cruelty, hurts too much. But then there are those who close the book and finally understand. Not with their heads, with their body, with that visceral feeling of recognition that makes you stop in the middle of your breath. Because you remember, that time in high school when everyone laughed at that weird kid and you laughed along because you didn't want to be the next target. That time at work when someone was too honest in a meeting and you saw the silent judgment in the eyes of the others and you said nothing. That time someone trusted you and you used that trust as leverage to get what you wanted. Little things. Nothing that would justify excessive guilt, right? Except that it was exactly those little things, multiplied by millions of people, that built the world that crushes the Mishkins. And here's the hardest truth of all. There's no going back. You can't undo what you've already done. You can't regain the innocence you've lost. You can't wake up tomorrow being Mishkin. But you can stop being the destroyer. You can for the first time recognize the game for what it is. Not an inevitable necessity, but a collective choice that everyone has made and continues to make. Dostoevsky wasn't interested in saving humanity. He knew that was impossible, but perhaps he was interested in waking some people up, in getting at least some to read his words and think twice before laughing at the next victim, before exploiting the next trust, before crushing the next person who dares to be different. Beauty will save the world, he wrote, but not as a motivational slogan, as a desperate question, as the last bet of a man who saw hell and still refused to give up on humanity completely. Beauty does not save because it is strong. It saves because it is fragile. Because looking at something beautiful, a person, a gesture, a moment of pure truth, and deciding to protect it instead of destroying it, that is the only revolutionary act left. You don't have to be Mishkin. No one is asking you to sacrifice yourself on an emotional cross. But you can stop being the one who holds the nails. You can stop laughing when you should defend. You can stop exploiting when you should honor. You can stop calling your own coldness wisdom and your own cruelty realism. And maybe, just maybe, the next time you meet someone who hasn't yet learned to play dirty, you'll do something different. It doesn't have to be grand, just don't participate in the destruction. Just don't be another one in the line of those who push. Because in the end, that's what Dostoevsky was asking for. Not that you be a hero, just that you stop being the villain you don't even realize you are. The idiot in the end is not Mishkin, he never was. The idiot is the one who destroyed everything human in himself and still thinks he won. Who traded his soul for crumbs of power and calls it success, who learned the language of cruelty so well that he forgot there were other ways to communicate. And if you've made it this far, if you're still listening, then at least part of you still knows this. You can still recognize the difference between surviving and living. You can still feel the weight of what has been lost. And that, however small it may seem, is already something. Because the first step to change is not to become perfect. It is to stop pretending that everything is fine. So here's my final question for you. Not as a provocation, but as a genuine invitation to reflection. Can you remember the exact moment when you decided that being true was too dangerous? And more importantly, do you still believe that? Write in the comments, not for me, for yourself. Because sometimes naming something is the first step to changing it. And if you want to continue this journey of waking up, of seeing the world and yourself more clearly, watch the next videos on the channel. Count on me and follow the white rabbit. Because in the end, Dostoevsky didn't write The Idiot to make you feel better. He wrote it to make you feel alive. And being alive, truly alive, means carrying the weight of your choices without hiding behind ready-made excuses. It means looking into the mirror he placed in front of you and finally seeing what has always been there. You don't have to be the idiot who crushes, but you also don't have to be the idiot who is crushed. You can simply be human, with all your flaws, with all your fears, but at least trying, at least not actively participating in the destruction. And maybe, just maybe that's enough, not to save the world, but to save what's left of you.